Have you ever wondered why the Bible uses Lord in all caps instead of God's personal Hebrew name? And what about the pronunciation? Is it Yahuah or Yahweh? Which one is it? Let's dive into these questions, explore the history, and see what understanding God's name truly means. And for an even more in-depth study of these ideas, check out my book, The Name Above All Names. What is the meaning behind God's Hebrew name? Well, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 16, God reveals himself to Moses as Ehyeh, a name that signifies his eternal, self-sustaining nature. The Hebrew Ehyeh translates into English to something close to I am, which is actually a profound revelation of God's timeless existence. But when God instructs his people to pass down his name to future generations, we find the 4 Hebrew letters Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey. But contrary to the popular belief, it's not about how it's vocalized. The Hebrew word for name is Shem, which carries a much deeper meaning than simply what someone is called. Shem encompasses one's reputation, one's essence, and their very being, the breath of life itself. So little known to most of us English-speaking Christians, Shem is inside of the Hebrew word for breath, Neshamah. The very letters for Shem, Shin, and Mem are nestled right in the middle of Neshamah, vividly illustrating that breath itself reflects God's very essence. This connection explains why everything that has breath should praise the Lord. It's not about breathing God's name audibly as Yahweh, but rather praising him with the life-giving breath he placed inside of you. It requires the exhalation of breath to be expressed, requiring that which was given by him in his life-giving nature. The Jewish historian Josephus described God's 4-letter Hebrew name, Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey, as consisting of 4 vowels. This reflects the unique vowel-like nature of God's sacred name. Unlike consonants, which typically involve the use of the lips, the tongue, and the teeth to control airflow, as in B, C, D, vowels rely on the continuous, unimpeded flow of the breath through the vocal cords. Vowels produce sounds shaped by the mouth and slightly by the lips, as in A, E, I, O, U, but always require a flow of breath to be expressed. This breath-centered nature explains why God's name is often described as breathy and invokes a sense of God's spirit or life. Ancient names like that in which we find Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey, with its flowing quality, are thought to resemble breath itself. The very letters of the name Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey involves a continuous flow of air that, even without clear vowel sounds, demonstrates the breathiness of God's name, linking his essence to the very life-giving breath found within us. So is Yahuah or Yahweh the right way to pronounce the 4 Hebrew letters Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey? I get a lot, I mean a lot, of bold comments from viewers that state that God's name should be pronounced Yahuah. But did you know that that pronunciation, Yahuah, is a relatively modern rendering of God's sacred name that gained traction around 1930? Largely through the sacred name movement, which sought to restore what is saw and what they thought as the original pronunciation of his name. The challenge is that the form Yahuah isn't attested for in early Hebrew manuscripts or ancient translations. It's a recent attempt to reimagine the Hebrew pronunciation of God's name. The pronunciation Yahuah experienced an even further reemergence in popularity in 2012 when the Cepher Bible was published by Dr. Stephen Pidgeon. His translation aimed to restore Hebrew names and terms, as well as the apocryphal books, and has since repopularized the use of Yahuah among video viewers. Like Yahuah, the early innovation of Yahweh is a reconstructed form of the 4 Hebrew letters Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey that became popular in 1869, largely due to the work of the German scholar and linguist Wilhelm Gesenius. He proposed that Yahweh was a likely pronunciation based on Greek transcripts and theophoric names. though it's still a reconstructed form that is popular in Christianity, but not in Judaism. My book, The Name Above All Names, explores this more in depth. These developments, the scholarship around them, and the various vocalizations of Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey as preserved in the Leningrad Codex, one of the oldest, most complete Hebrew manuscripts, which contains at least 10 different vocalizations of Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey based on vowel points. So why did the King James Bible replace God's name with Lord? It didn't. It's actually a misnomer that the King James Bible replaced God's name with Lord. By the time the King James Bible was completed in 1611, the tradition of substituting God's name with Adonai, meaning Lord in Hebrew, or Kyrios in Greek, had been well established for over 1,300 years. The practice began with the 3rd century BC Septuagint, where Kyrios, which is the Greek rendering for Lord, replaced the letters Yod, Hey, Vav, and Hey. Jewish traditions substituted Adonai out of reverence for God's name, which influenced later translations like the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century. This long-standing tradition shaped the approach of translators such as those of the Wycliffe Bible, the Tyndale Bible, and ultimately the King James Bible, making Lord in all caps a consistent choice for English Bibles. I must reiterate that by the time the King James Bible came along in 1611, using Lord in all caps in place of God's name as given in Hebrew was a well-established tradition as a respect of Jewish customs, which refrained from vocalizing his name and used Adonai, Lord, instead. The translators continued this reverent tradition to ensure continuity and respect, yet it came at the cost of obscuring the personal, covenantal aspect of God's name. In my book, The Name Above All Names, I address how this choice shaped our understanding of God's identity as English readers. So, what should we call God? You may be wondering how to address God in prayer, worship, or maybe even conversation. Based on my experience, addressing God respectfully can include, but not limited to, using the name given in the Hebrew tradition, Adonai, calling him Lord, or even calling him God. What's key is understanding that God is not human. His very essence transcends naming. The Apostle Paul tries to convey this in Acts chapter 17, where he says, "For as I passed by, I beheld your devotions. I found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship. Him declare I unto you, God.' God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and have made one blood of all nations of men for to dwell all in the face of the earth, and have determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation." We can also see this by going back to the Old Testament, where the Bible itself tells us that God wasn't known by the 4 Hebrew letters, Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey, from Adam to Moses. That's about 2,500 years. That's over half of the 4,000 years that the Bible covers. During that time, God related to his people in ways they could understand, showing that he values our sincerity and reverence over precise vocalization of Yod, Hey, Vav, and Hey. For this reason, as well as the 10 variants of the pronunciation of God's name as given in the Leningrad Codex, when I speak publicly, I choose to spell out Yod, Hey, Vav, and Hey. And in writing, I use the letters YHWH. But in private, I use YHVH. I find that this approach respects God's name and essence while allowing for a personal and respectful connection. So is it deception to use Lord instead of God's Hebrew name? Some might feel that replacing the name God gave Moses with Lord diminishes the name's meaning. But understanding the Hebrew word Shem helps clarify this. Passing down God's name wasn't about its pronunciation. It was about carrying forward who he is, his reputation, his essence, and his faithfulness. We see an example of this in how God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reminding each generation of his character and promises. Interestingly, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not know God by the name he gave Moses some 1,000 years later. Yet they knew his character and his promises, a legacy more meaningful than a simple utterance. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 8 calls us to uphold God's name, his essence and values, and pass on who he is, his very character, on to future generations. For more on this, the name above all names provides a thorough exploration of God's identity as described in ancient sources. So while replacing God's Hebrew name with Lord might seem misleading, it's actually a shift in tone from intimate name to a reverent title. Some modern translations have restored God's four-letter name to help readers connect more deeply with the unique depth of God's name. Keeping Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey in mind when we read the Lord can enrich our understanding of God's covenant and invite us to experience his character more fully. This is a bit like how people address me today. You might know me as Pastor G, but if you know me well, you wouldn't call me by that name. And if you know me very well, you'd know me by an even more personal name than those who just know me. So ultimately, knowing the history behind God's four-letter Hebrew name, Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey, and its substitution, Lord, gives us a deeper appreciation for God's presence and character. My book, The Name Above All Names, offers an exhaustive look at these details, the nuances of the Hebrew word Shem, and the significance of the four Hebrew letters Yod-Hey-Vav-Hey, and the various vocalizations as given in the Leningrad Codex. If you'd like to dive deeper into translation choices and how they impact our Bible study today, get The Name Above All Names, and be sure to check out the next video.